Well, after our visit to Versailles, let's back up and lay out a musical roadmap that will take us from late Renaissance times, right before 1600, through the years when Louis XIV was creating his palace complex, and right into the 18th century, when a composer named Johann Sebastian Bach was building his career. In short, a roadmap through the first 150 of the 300 years of music we're covering in this course. And that brings up this question: why 300 years? Why not 200 years or 400 years? Here's the reason. The 300 years from roughly 1600 to 1900 mark what we call the common practice era in music. That's a useful term, and it's not in Italian. What does it mean? Common practice era means the time period when music was commonly practiced in a certain way. By practiced, I mean composed, performed, and understood. Think of a doctor who practices medicine, or an attorney who practices law. Common practice era is a term that no one during those 300 years would have used or even recognized. It's one of those academic descriptions applied long after the fact, but it's useful to us. Let's see why. Music in those 3 centuries expressed certain common values and qualities. Let me give you 6 of them. First, music had a clear pulse or beat, usually in groupings of 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, duple or triple meter, we'd say. Second, gradually after 1600, the multiple scales used to write music were whittled down to 2 scales known to most people today as major and minor. Third, musical style began to favor a clear melody supported by a clear bass line. Fourth, music was composed in specific and mostly predictable forms. The patterns of contrast and repetition that create form in the listener's ear became familiar and were expected. Fifth, music was played on more or less the same instruments we know today: violins, violas, cellos, flutes, oboes, trumpets, horns, trombones, organs. We're familiar with all of these instruments today. And sixth, those instruments were played in a traditional manner. Instruments weren't stuck down into a bucket of water to see what that would sound like, or played from the wrong end, or threaded with objects from a hardware store so that they'd make new sounds. Don't laugh. Those things would happen in the 20th century in what we tend to call loosely the modern period. And for many historians, radical changes in music and the arts after 1900 did turn the page on the old and launched Western culture into a revolutionary era. So, we'll use common practice era to describe 300 years of music from approximately 1600 until 1900-ish. Let's start our roadmap shortly before 1600. Some composers working at that time were already seeking new directions, and change, once it started, happened quickly. Much of it in Italy, not surprisingly. Much of it happened in Florence, a lovely, exceptionally cultured city, the birthplace of writers like Dante and Boccaccio, and painters Brunelleschi and Da Vinci, a perfect city for artistic experimentation. In fact, the most significant of all common practice era genres, opera, was invented in Florence. To see how music after 1600 departed from the older Renaissance style, we need to take a minute to characterize Renaissance style. First, let's remind ourselves what Renaissance means. Renaissance equals rebirth, in this case, rebirth of the ideals of classical antiquity. The word says it all. Re, again, and naissance, the French noun for birth. The British pronounce it renaissance, which makes its meaning much clearer. Well, the Renaissance had been an amazing time. Gutenberg's printing presses, developed in the mid-15th century, had created a technological and cultural revolution. They made information available to what we call the masses at a cost and with an ease never before imaginable. The Renaissance abounded in scientific discovery, and for the visual arts and for architecture, it was a time of great flowering. Plus, it was a time when significant opposition to the church's authority led both to the violent split between Catholics and Protestants known as the Reformation, and unintentionally to a gradual questioning of the role of the church. This increased focus on human achievements is usually called humanism. Renaissance musical styles had reached such high points of development, there was essentially nowhere left for them to develop other than to fracture into new directions. And that's what often happens. A style stretches or intensifies until it hits a breaking point. What if you added sugar to a cup of hot tea? The first teaspoon or two is lovely, but after about 25 teaspoons, you'd end up with syrup. At that point, your mouth is begging for something clean and clear, a glass of water. And Baroque music was that glass of water. Or think of it this way. What if you're building a house of cards? You build higher, and then one last card, and poof, the whole thing collapses. You'd go from a 3D structure to a thin layer of cards lying on a table. Well, development of artistic style works that way too. An art form gets so complex that there will be a reaction, and usually the resulting art comes out much simpler and clearer. So, now, what happens if a composer is living through such a time of transformation? Does he stick with the old styles in which he was trained and has been successful? Or does he go with the flow and take on the new? It depends. Let's talk about one great composer who is famous in part because he made the switch so well. The career of Italian genius Claudio Monteverdi sprawled across the late Renaissance into the Baroque. He spent the first half of his career writing gorgeous pieces that followed the complex rules of Renaissance style. Then, voila, he heard a new, sparse, clean sound, and he embraced it to the horror of many of his friends. Monteverdi became a leader in writing new music. For years, his music had been highly polyphonic, or composed of layers of independent melodies woven together, creating a web of musical lines. We'll come back to that in a minute. But right about 1600, Monteverdi embraced the new, cleaner style, and he became a leader in writing the single-line, speech-like style of melody that we will call recitative. Recitative means exactly what it says, reciting words musically, or setting a text to a flexible melody that captures the rhythm and intonation of speech. Recitative was the key ingredient in forming the Baroque era's most significant genre, opera. The contrast between late Renaissance style and early Baroque style was so great, people even coined terms for it. Prima pratica, first or older practice for the thicker polyphonic Renaissance style, and secundo pratica, second or new style, for the new simpler style, which was also called monody or single-line music. Here's the thing, Monteverdi was successful in both styles, and to show his commitment to the new or second practice, he decided to write one of those new music dramas that featured recitative. And it turned out to be an exquisite work. We call it his first opera, but it was perceived then as drama per musica, a theatrical piece with music. It took a few decades before that term opera was generally employed. Okay, let's talk about opera. Opera is simply a play where all or part of the script is set to music and sung. The performers are up on stage in costumes, acting and singing, while some kind of band or orchestra plays the music to accompany them. Monteverdi's first opera, Orfeo, written in 1607, starts with a short, ear-catching fanfare, which the composer called a toccata. Toccata comes from the Italian verb toccare, to play. Later on, toccatas would become much longer compositions, especially for keyboard. But this one is short and functions as a fanfare to get the audience's attention. It is repeated 3 times, and you will hear it played on your listening set by the kind of Renaissance instruments that Monteverdi specified for his score. Some of those instruments sound a little strange to our ears today. They are instruments that got left behind within the next few decades of common practice era instrumentation. By the way, instrumentation means choosing the exact instruments for a piece of music. You'll also hear the term orchestration. The point is, 1607 was pretty early in the game for a composer to be specific in his instrumentation. But that was one of the innovations around 1600 and one which Monteverdi was very much responsible for. Composers were also interested in the pitting of the sound of instruments against the mass of voices in a choir, or in creating interesting large blocks of instrumental sound. On your listening set, you'll find a canzona by Giovanni Gabrieli, a master composer of the Cathedral of St. Mark's, Venice, who wrote brilliant music for wind ensembles. Gabrieli also wrote what we call cori spezzati, meaning broken or antiphonal choruses for choirs, set on opposite balconies of the grandiose St. Mark's Cathedral. He definitely liked blocks of powerful sound, and it's a great example of how architecture can influence music. But let's get back to Orfeo. After the fanfare, which I hope you'll either like the minute you hear it, or get to like after a few hearings, Monteverdi introduces la musica, an allegorical or symbolic character who talks about the power of music. A catchy passage of instrumental music that repeats several times frames la musica's beautiful recitative. Then, the work opens properly with Act 1, which functions mostly like a Renaissance pastoral play, a story with a bucolic setting, with lots of shepherds and shepherdesses, and folk choruses and dancing. In the second act, Monteverdi focused more on the new second practice. Let me remind you of the Orpheus story, which you may have studied in mythology. Orpheus is the son of Apollo. He loses his beloved Eurydice, or Eurydice, depending on how you pronounce her name. She is bitten by a snake and goes to the afterlife. Hades, the afterlife, you may recall from Greek mythology, is not the same as Christian hell. It's simply the place everyone goes after death. It's entered by crossing the river Styx. Orpheus, or Orfeo to use the Italian, can't accept Eurydice's death, so he goes to Hades himself to get her back. By performing music, he first lulls to sleep the boatman who guards the river Styx, and then, by more musical skills, he convinces the god of the underworld, Plutone, to release Eurydice. In illustrations, you usually see Orfeo doing this by singing and or by playing the lyre, a handheld harp. The music works, he gets her back, but he breaks the given condition that he not look at her, and depending on which ending to the myth you know, he loses her forever. Or you may know another ending, such as he goes to the underworld to join her in a kind of happy ending. Happy ending in Italian is called lieto fine, and it became a theatrical requirement for Baroque drama, no matter how tragic the story. In Monteverdi's ending to Orfeo, there is a lieto fine. Or, I should say, it's a half-happy ending, given by the librettist, the writer of the text, Alessandro Striggio, who based his texts on works by Rinuccini and Ovid. That's the thing about opera. Even in the most modern operas today, you can often trace the stories, the texts, even the musical structures back, all the way to classical Greece. Anyway, back to our unhappy Orfeo. Apollo descends to comfort his grieving son, and they both ascend up to the gods, without Eurydice. Not completely a happy ending. It was happy enough to fulfill the theatrical requirement of lieto fine. Monteverdi chose the Orpheus myth carefully because he knew he was testing his skills by creating this new form of music drama, this drama per musica. Monteverdi proved just how effective recitative could be in the biggest moment of the opera, the long, heart-rending monologue called Possente Spiritu, when Orfeo convinces Plutone to give him back Eurydice. Besides, who doesn't like the idea that a beautiful song can open the gates of hell. Monteverdi continued to write various kinds of new dramatic works based on Greek and Roman mythology or history. His final opera, The Coronation of Poppaea, is just as riveting today as any opera you might name, and it's often performed. I find the happy ending to The Coronation of Poppaea particularly interesting. The opera concludes with the two villainous main characters singing a glorious love duet. So, technically, it was a happy ending, but everyone in the audience knew how actual Roman history had gone downhill. They knew that wicked Queen Poppaea and Emperor Nerone, or Nero, had ended up paying for crimes, terrible crimes. That means that the theatrical convention for a happy ending was fulfilled at the end of the opera, while the moral necessity of condemning Poppaea and Nerone for their misdeeds was accomplished in the minds of the audience. Pretty good trick, huh? By the time Coronation of Poppaea was written in 1642, music had moved pretty far from the complex Renaissance style into the new Baroque style. Okay, I'm using that B word again. Baroque style. Maybe we'd better find out what the term Baroque means. Baroque is a funny term, to be sure. The etymology or history of the word is interesting. It's French taken from Portuguese baruco, meaning misshapen pearl. Scholars are still establishing who used the term Baroque first. In music, it showed up in 1733 in a satirical letter after the premiere of a new opera by French composer Jean-Philippe Rameau, the next major French opera composer after Lully. But the writer was not using the word Baroque to praise the opera, not at all. Instead, he described the opera as du Baroque, implying the music was in bad taste. Too many misshapen things, strident harmonies, unpredictable melodies, strange shifts in tempo, too dissonant, too modern, we might say. 13 years later, a writer in 1746, in an edition of a Paris journal, used a contrast between music that was chantant, tuneful, and baroque, rough. Labeling something baroque still wasn't a compliment. The descriptive baroque continued to indicate dissonant, disorderly, ill-defined for about another century, long after people had stopped writing music in that style. Then, in 1839, well into the Romantic era, a German scholar, Jakob Burckhardt, used the term Baroque Stil, Baroque style, in a neutral or scientific way to describe the general style of art after Michelangelo. Others took up the term, and they found it useful for categorizing post-Renaissance visual art and architecture. Finally, in the 1920s, another German scholar named Kurt Sachs took the principles of 17th century art. By then, this Baroque art was worth a fortune on the auction block, and he created parallels with music from the same era. Fast forward a few more decades, and by the 1950s, the term Baroque came to be a neutral description for European music between 1600 and about 1750. And that's how you get from misshapen pearl to a fancy term Baroque that sounds erudite and scholarly today. Did I say 1750? That's a date often given for the end of the Baroque, and it sounds familiar. Isn't that one of our key dates? Yes, it's the date of Johann Sebastian Bach's death. And some people did start saying, well, Johann Sebastian Bach died in 1750, so 1750 must be the end of the Baroque period. We'll be talking soon in detail about Johann Sebastian Bach. But for now, just know that his death didn't signal the end to an entire musical era. First of all, he wasn't that famous. You'd have to be pretty famous to end an artistic era. Now, he did have some fame, and certain of his compositions were handed down from generation to generation. But decades would pass before Bach's music was rediscovered by a group of people who cared enough to bring it back into the limelight. In fact, the Bach rediscovery didn't get cranked up until the early 19th century. And when it did, it was part of a 19th century movement towards rediscovery, and it was done in a big way. For example, on March 11, 1829, there was what we might call a media event in Berlin when a popular German composer, Felix Mendelssohn, conducted a version of Bach's amazing St. Matthew Passion at a high-profile concert. That performance started a lot of other Bach revivals rolling, but even then, Bach's mega-composer status came only in the mid-20th century. Another reason we can't use Bach's death date to mark the end of Baroque style is that his music was already old-fashioned when he was writing it. That means he stayed with older musical styles while other composers were already switching to the new ones. Bach even recognized that he was behind the curve, and occasionally he tried writing in the new styles, especially because his sons Johann Christian Bach and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach were making big names for themselves writing new music. Anyway, let's be content to say that a lot of musical styles that we will call Baroque started around 1600 and gradually were replaced by newer styles about 120 years or so later, about the 1720s, 1730s. Then watch those new styles take on various names, including Stile Galant, Rococo, Pre-Classical, and Classical, all of which will merge into a new big style era that we'll call the Romantic, starting in the late 18th century and going on into the 19th. Got it? And if you're confused, that's why you have a timeline in your resource book. So now, let's back up again. Baroque style was highly polyphonic, so we better take up this term polyphonic, which means many-voicedness, or having many independent melody lines sounding simultaneously. Music at the height of the Renaissance, the 1500s, had become highly polyphonic. This was a great achievement of Western music in that era. You see, polyphony is a basic characteristic of Western music, but it started very simply. And you might ask, how long ago? There's not much of a surviving record of any Western musical development before the 900s AD. From the 1100s or 12th century, the writing down of music is more common, but it was music for the choirs, for churches. Monks, or monastics to use a fancy word, were about the only people with the skills and equipment necessary to undertake this complex activity. Music was handwritten on parchment, which is stretched, dried, and treated animal skin, sometimes called vellum, depending on the animal. We mentioned this in our second unit. And because music was handwritten, it's also called manuscript. You know, one of my colleagues calls the medieval manuscript the best example of medieval high-tech. The technology necessary to treat the animal skin, create the inks, dyes, and concentrations of ground precious and semi-precious stones, plus form the sheets of gold leaf used to decorate the pictures called illuminations, as well as the mathematics and the graphics for the page layouts, plus the artistic skills necessary, well, not much could top that. Based on what we know, medieval music sung by choirs in the 9th and the 10th centuries had a single melody line, which we call chant. We also call it monody or monophony, or one sound. These melodies are hypnotic in their beauty, and some of them are still used in writing music today. From the 11th century on, through what we call the medieval period, music did what music always does. It became more complex. Music moved from having one chant melody to two chant melodies, and then three chant melodies, all independent melodies, but sung simultaneously in that tight weave we call polyphony. In fact, weaving is a pretty good analogy of how all of this worked. Medieval music is a huge topic, but we're going to keep it to those few sentences, okay? Moving along. Eventually, as time passed, 3 melodic lines will become 4, and as music gets more complex, new rules will come in. The interaction of simultaneous melodies required control, a system with strict rules, and we call that system counterpoint. And the rules of that system dominated Renaissance music, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. Composers combined 4, 5, or sometimes 6 independent melody lines, following the rules of counterpoint. You might think of it as 4 or 5 persons talking at the same time, but saying different things. That doesn't work out too well with speech, but it works out very nicely in music. The main thing is the singers weren't singing harmonies. Instead, the Renaissance ear perceived these lines as a matrix of interwoven vocal lines with points of stress and release called dissonance and consonance. The big thing composers tried to do was to create dissonance or tension between individual voice parts following strict rules called part writing, and then let that tension relax into sounds that sounded more pleasant or consonant together. Think of it as pedaling a bicycle up a series of steep little hills and then coasting down. Tension, relaxation, tension, relaxation. That dynamic of tension, release, propelled Renaissance counterpoint into incredible complexity. It was and remains one of the most sophisticated ways to compose in all of Western music. Even today, music majors in college take classes in the rudiments of Renaissance counterpoint, and they usually groan like mad through all of their homework assignments. Of course, if you grew up in a boys' choir in the 1550s, singing this music every day wasn't hard. But learning how to write it in the 21st century, well, that's pretty tough. But remember, there is always a limit to how complex a system becomes before it collapses. Remember the house of cards? And when a style does collapse, it rises as a completely new system based on totally different musical principles. That new system was key to the new Baroque style, and it's called Basso continuo. Basso continuo is a sound created by two players. One plays a chord-producing instrument like a harpsichord, an organ, or a stringed instrument that plays chords like a lute, guitar, or harp. And the other person plays a sustaining low melodic instrument like a bassoon or a cello. The person playing the chords plays specific intervals that create what we call harmonies. The player finds the chords by reading figures or numbers written below the bass melody, a kind of musical shorthand. And the harmonies changed very often in Baroque style. Chord, new chord, next chord, next chord. We say that that music has a fast harmonic rhythm, and we contrast that term with another, surface rhythm. Let me demonstrate these so that they make more sense. Here's the thing about harmonic rhythm. A piece can seem very slow, and yet it can have a very rapid rate of change for the harmonies. Here's a good example, this hymn. It's usually called, O Sacred Head Now Wounded. And while it may seem slow and meditative, those harmonies are changing virtually every beat. Change, 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 change. Change, 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 change. Fast harmonic rhythm. Contrast that with a very different style of hymn, which seems to have a lot more going on in it. That's what we would call sort of the surface rhythm of all the notes passing by. And yet, rate of change of harmonies, very slow. I'm thinking of this one. Lots going on, and yet two chords. Chord, da, 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 da. New chord, da, 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 da. Back to the first chord. Very slow rate of harmonic change. Two ways of listening. When you listen to Baroque music, you will hear that low melodic instrument, say the cello, sawing away in the bass, while the chording instrument, let's use harpsichord, fills in with highly energetic patterns that outline the harmonies. And then everything else, the violins, the singers, will be added in on top of it all. Basso continuo created a very cool sound, and it became a trademark of Baroque music. Actually, the composer could write the most interesting basso continuo, but unless the players were good at realizing the complex number shorthand, well, it just didn't work. We use the term realizing to mean the reading and playing of all these notes. That means the player has to have the skill and virtuosity necessary to fill everything in and to make it sound free and improvised, and hopefully to make it sound easy, even if there are a lot of difficult passages. And that brings up the idea of virtuosity again. Virtuosity, the ability to play or sing very well, has always been important, but it became even more significant during the Baroque. Some musical forms were created primarily so that the composer or performer, usually the same person, could show off his skills or his chops, as musicians like to call it today. New pieces for keyboard and for lute and guitar tended to be highly virtuosic, and the names matched. For instance, pieces where the player touched notes quickly were called toccatas. You remember we had that term earlier from the Italian verb toccare, to play. The fantasy or fantasia was another popular genre, a highly creative type of composition built from spontaneous sounding passages that contrasted with structured sections. Just the word fantasy conjures up the idea of how imaginative it could be. Other pieces were designed to warm up the fingers or to introduce a set of short pieces, and these were called preludia or preludes. You can hear the spontaneity in this beautiful prelude that introduces a set of dances by an early Baroque composer named Denis Gautier. Then there was another group of pieces which took up the principles of Renaissance vocal counterpoint and turned them into mathematically precise musical puzzles called fugues. A fugue is a highly developed piece of polyphony, usually for instruments. The simple way to start explaining a fugue is to compare it with a round, like row, row, row your boat. One voice starts, another comes in with the same melody, and so it goes. But a fugue is more complicated than that. After the melody appears in all of the parts, a new section called an episode begins that uses different contrasting material. Later, the opening melody reappears in all of the parts one by one, and then there's another episode, and then so on and so on, highly structured, yes? Plus, there are rules about how the melodies combine with one another. Sometimes the melodies crowd themselves together like people pushing onto a metro. At other times, they space themselves out as if stretched on a rubber band. Add to that the fact that the composer can turn the melody upside down, seriously, I'm not joking, and even run it backwards, all in a very strict design that has to be learned with great effort by a composer. That's the reason why fugues are called learned music, which generally means a composition that requires complex skill and understanding of counterpoint. And it takes a bit of a learned ear to hear it all, but it's great fun once you do. The other incredibly important thing that happened in the Baroque period, in addition to Basso continuo and counterpoint, was the arrival of 3 new types of musical drama. We've already introduced the one with the biggest impact, opera. The second and third genres are also for voice and instruments and are called oratorio and cantata. We'll talk about them in the next unit. So let's continue concentrating on opera for now and pick up our story back with Monteverdi. By the time he died in 1643, opera was well established, and it grew and grew, becoming the most important thing going on in the music world. For 3 centuries, opera dominated Western music, offering the same type of entertainment that movies do today. Let me say that again. Opera offered the same type of entertainment that movies do today. And that's what's hard for some people new to opera to believe, especially if their only encounter with opera has been some 90-second excerpt on a TV screen or some corny joke about it's not over till the fat lady sings. The singers in opera were superstars. People gossiped about them the way they do about Hollywood actors today. Composers, librettists, producers, anyone associated with the opera world worked at the heartbeat central in the entertainment world. The next big change in opera came mid-17th to late 17th century, when composers started separating the action-oriented speech, or recitative, from the emotionally expressive parts, which we'll now call arias. So, if someone ran in and said, "The emperor has been stabbed, the palace is burning, quick, grab a coat and get out the back door," that text would be set into the musical speech style of recitative. Why? Because that text was primarily informative. Recitative was packed with information.
In this scene, the character Fiordiligi and her sister have just declared their undying love for Guglielmo and Ferrando, who have gone off to war. And then, out of nowhere, come these two presumptuous foreigners who try to court the two sisters. Well, their response is absolutely not, get out of here, but they just keep after it and keep after it, and finally Fiordiligi just says enough, and she lets them have it. And this is what she says: "You have a lot of nerve coming in here with your beautiful words, defiling our pure innocent ears and our innocent hearts, and it doesn't matter what you say, you are not going to get anywhere with me." This is what it sounds like in Italian. "Temerari, sortite fuori di questo loco, e non profani l'alito infausto degli infami retti, nostro cor, nostro orecchio, e nostri affetti," etc., etc. And this is what it sounds like when she sings it. "Temerari, sortite fuori di questo loco, e non profani l'alito infausto degli infametti, nostro cor, nostro orecchio, e nostri affetti. In van per voi, per gli altri invan, si cerca le nostre anime."
This kind of recitative needed to go by fast, so it was accompanied by rapid harmonies in the harpsichord, a crisp, dry sound, which led to the use of the term secco, or dry in Italian, hence secco recitative. So much for recitative. Now, what's an aria? Let's say the rest of our characters get safely out of the burning palace, but then the emperor's daughter starts to lament her stabbed father and her burning house. Her emotional text would be set into a strictly rhythmic or metered song called an aria. That word rhythmic is key. Recitative was free-flowing like speech, but arias had a definite pulse. "Oh, whoa, Dad's been stabbed. Oh, whoa, Dad's been stabbed, 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 and the palace is gone. Whoa, whoa, stabbed and gone." And that's kind of how arias went. Not too many different words, but lots of emotion. The pulse was regular, so you could tap your foot to it. Tap it slowly, of course, in this example, because it's a sad aria. Meanwhile, the guy who stabbed the emperor and burned the palace takes the stage in the next scene and sings in recitative, "Guess what? We burned the palace, we ran everyone out, and our army is now in charge of the country. Isn't that terrific?" All in free recitative. Then he'd sing a different kind of aria. "Triumph, triumph, we have won. Joy, triumph, we have won. The king is dead and we have won. Triumph, triumph, we have won." And of course the music for that aria will be lively, loud, and definitely not sad. Arias became the spot in the music where a singer would show off vocal fireworks. By the end of the 17th century, singers expected and usually got a certain number of arias, and if they didn't, they were unhappy. Singers love to sing, and they aren't that happy when they stand around not singing. The arias fit into a grid of specific emotions, specific, distinct emotions. There would be an aria di bravura. Bravura, you may know, means bravery, boldness, even foolhardy daring. So that aria would be energetic and with a strong rhythm, perhaps like a march. Then there'd be a certain number of arias called aria di cantabile. Cantabile means singing, as in sweetly singing. So those arias would be about sweet or sentimental things and could sort of sway gently. And then there were other aria types. Remember this, because in our next unit, we'll learn that these specific, distinct emotions coordinated with something called the doctrine of the affections. Also in operas, there were duets, where two characters would sing a song together, and trios. As time went on, bigger groups of solo characters sang together, quartets, quintets, and even sextets by the time you get to the 19th century. That was a big deal because each of the characters would sing different words, but somehow it all came out perfectly. But that's later in the 19th century. We need to get back to Baroque opera. Baroque opera became known as opera seria, or serious opera. Not only was it serious, as intended for formal occasions and for the upper educated classes, but it used serious stories from Roman and Greek history or classical mythology. Costumes and sets were grand, and it was a kind of impressive but sometimes stiff evening. But here's the thing. Audiences didn't just sit there as they do today. Attending an opera was a dynamic event, much like going to a rock or country western concert today. People milled in and out. They socialized right in the hall, even during the music. The fancy folks had private boxes where their servants set out supper and sweets, and everybody gawked at what people wore. The social aspect of attending opera grew to be as important as the music, and file this away. That will really irk composers, some of whom will try to change this by reining in the goings-on and getting people to pay attention to the stage. Well, good luck on that. Still, Baroque audiences did stop their card games for the one thing they loved, the high, fast, virtuosic singing that was called coloratura. They especially liked the high voices of what were called the castrati. Castrati, you will recall from our unit on Versailles, were the men who, as boys, had had outstanding voices and musical talent. As pre-adolescents, they underwent a surgical procedure that changed how their voices developed. Their voices stayed high like sopranos, but as they grew into men, their powerful chests and their great lung capacity meant that they could really produce the sound. They could spin high melodic lines with ferocity. They outclassed most of the equally talented sopranos who were jealous of these castrati. The castrati played the best heroic roles. They were idolized by the public, and they made more money than the sopranos. Eventually, public taste moved away from this style of opera seria with its formal plots, its single emotion arias, and its superstar castrati. By the mid-18th century, in part as a response to the 18th century ideals of the Enlightenment and the embrace of the natural that we'll be talking about later, people wanted something that was more natural, and they'll get it in what we call comic opera or opera buffa. We'll talk about comic opera in another unit, but suffice it to say that right around the time the Baroque era was coming to a close in the 1720s or 30s, short comic mini-operas were placed between the acts of the serious operas. They were called intermezzi, or intermission features, and people enjoyed them as much, if not more, than the main operas, which were weighed down by lofty characters, tragedies, and predictability. You can make a comparison here with something we all know, commercials. Let's face it, TV commercials are often more entertaining than the shows themselves, and they can be a welcome relief in serious shows. Plus, think of the hype surrounding commercials during the Super Bowl. People talk about them before and after the game is over. The game is long forgotten, and we're still evaluating the wacky commercials. And that's basically what happened with these comic intermission features called intermezzi. They became the hit news. Considering everything, counterpoint, basso continuo, and all of the new musical genres, opera was still the biggest news in the Baroque era. Opera was and remains the most expensive of all music to produce. Today, wealthy donors underwrite productions, but back then, only kings and noblemen could afford to produce opera, and for a long time, only the immediate royal family, friends, and guests could see it. Eventually, some public opera theaters were built, starting in the cities that had economies built around free trade, cities like Venice and Hamburg. By the mid-18th century, it became relatively easy to purchase a ticket to see opera, and, as you might guess, the more opera catered to paying customers, the more opera reflected popular issues and trends. One word of caution. Whatever the Italian musical fashions were, the French never went along with them, not if they could help it. Okay, they did borrow Italian technology for things like fountains and mirrors, but they resisted Italian music. Instead, the French developed their own versions of operas, calling their serious Baroque operas tragédies lyriques. The elegance and the pacing of the French language demanded a different style of vocal recitative. Plus, they liked French recitative to be much more lushly accompanied by strings, maybe even winds, rather than by just harpsichord or basso continuo. Beyond that, as you remember from visiting Versailles, the French adored the visual components of processionals and promenades, as well as the spectacle of dancing. The Italian operas didn't begin to offer enough of those extravagances for French taste. And so, before the Baroque era was over, you found competitive Italian and French opera companies arising in many cities across Europe, even in Russia. And the more competition there was, the bigger opera became. Opera, big business, and big news, theatrical news that people on the street would buzz up or buzz down, making or breaking many a career, that's for sure. Do you find that hard to believe? If so, then use your imagination and try to convince yourself. Actually, the best way to change the opinion of someone who views opera as stuffy or boring is to take that person to a rehearsal of a professional opera company. Anybody who sits there and sees and hears the singers, the musicians, the dancers, plus goes backstage to see the amazing complex of sets, props, costumes, people doing makeup, people controlling the lighting, well, that person will end up mesmerized. And nowadays, big opera companies like the Metropolitan Opera in New York City are sending HD satellite transmissions of their performances to regular movie theaters all across the world. Live broadcasts that put the viewer right into the high-dollar seats, plus star hosts that will take us backstage for fantastic looks at things no audience member ever gets to see. All the while, you can be there chomping down on popcorn and gummy bears. It's pretty glamorous. And speaking of fun, we'll take up parties in our next unit when we look at the influence of something called the liturgical calendar on the rhythms of social and artistic life.